Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the penultimate session of this Festival of Ideas on the subject of the pull of the landscape, the artist's share. I must start with a few housekeeping announcements and something more than a housekeeping announcement. I obviously want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the tribal owners of this land and their continuing title to it. Now, can I ask you all to turn your cell phones to silent so that those who wish to tweet can tweet, but those who want to talk to Aunt Mabel can't. And that would be a firm request. I should point out that the entire session is being filmed. If you don't want to appear in glorious Technicolor in the streaming from the University of Melbourne, then refrain from asking a question, as the question will be filmed. Could I say at the outset that we've had some difficulty in lighting the stage so that it can be filmed without detracting from the quality of the slide projection. Harsh words have been exchanged between science and technology on this topic. And we now have the best of all possible arrangements, but the university has a projector in here which detests art and loves pie charts. So we're going to have some loss in the quality of the images, and every artist is allowed to complain once and only once about it during their talk. I should say that the afternoon session begins at 1:30 and will be chaired by the brilliant and dynamic Max Delaney of the Monash University Museum of Art. And that will be on contemporary visions and critiques of the landscape. But this morning it's the pull of the landscape, the artist's share. And it seemed to me that it was absolutely right and appropriate that artists should have the final say at this particular festival on the theme of the pursuit of identity. For it really has been artists, since the very beginning, have to a great extent shaped our awareness, our sense, and our sense of valuing and the significance of the land and the landscape in Australia. When we think of it, the longest, most continuous tradition of image making anywhere in the world is, of course, that which has been made by Indigenous Australians, through paintings in the sand, through rock carvings, through works on bark. And nearly all of that great tradition of Indigenous art making is predicated on two things. First of all, understanding the land. Because if you don't understand the land, if you don't understand where the waterholes are, where the soaks are, then you will not survive in that landscape. So it's an art of survival above all else. It's also, of course, an art of great mythic presence, the memory of the past, the memory of the dreaming when the land was formed itself. And that has now become such an active part of all of our consciousness, too, of the landscape of Australia. But what has been absolutely remarkable in the years since white settlement began, that really rather indifferent artists like John Glover, who was a rather boring Regency artist in London, when he comes to Tasmania, he becomes a different kind of painter. And he becomes a different kind of painter because he has to respond to a new and different landscape. And that really brings the best out in him. And even today, preferably tomorrow, because I want you to come to the session this afternoon, you can all go down to the Federation Square, the National Gallery's quarters there, and see the splendid Eugène von Gerard exhibition, probably our greatest mid-19th century landscape painter. And von Gerard, too, was a pretty ordinary, common garden, late-flowering German romantic artist in Germany, but when he comes to Australia, comes and paints in the high country, in the valley of the Mitta, he becomes a sublime painter. And he offers this great paradox of both, is it a trackless wilderness, which we behold in Australia, or is it like creation itself, the day after creation, the untouched virgin world? It's a great paradox, which is right there in that exhibition. And almost ever since, from John Glover on, we've had, every significant generation has produced important landscape painting. The Heidelberg School, right down to Sidney Nolan, Arthur Boyd, and Fred Williams, who are the kind of preeminent painters of whom the landscape has played a crucial central role in their art. And so I believe it continues into the present. And I have on stage here three of the most really remarkable and distinguished painters in Melbourne who have continued to look at the landscape, say new, interesting and challenging things about it. Now, rather unfairly, some of the younger and more impertinent members of the staff of the Festival of Ideas refer to this panel as the Golden Oldies. And we absolutely repudiate the title, and instead we want to be regarded as mature-age students, as they used to say at the university of anybody over 40. And so we're the mature-age students, and this afternoon, Max Delaney's panel will bring the brilliant, the brash, and the young to the floor. But the first artist to speak to us this morning is Jan Senbergs. Jan Senbergs has had a most remarkable and distinguished career as an artist. He's won his great slew of art prizes, from the Helena Rubinstein Travelling Scholarship in the 1960s to the William DeBell Prize for Drawing in the 1990s. He's had important museum survey exhibitions at Heidi, at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, at the Ballarat Art Gallery, and he's been a regular exhibitor in both Melbourne and Sydney. In 1989 to 1990, the Northern academic year, he was the first artist to occupy the chair of Australian Studies at Harvard University, which he did he occupied with great distinction. He's painted the landscape in a variety of places and a variety of venues. He first made his first set of real drawings of a landscape were done at Port Melbourne in the most wonderful series of Port Melbourne pastels, which are now almost 40 years ago. But he's painted in the Otways, he's painted in New Zealand, he's painted in the south coast of New South Wales, an extraordinary variety of landscapes. And then more recently, he's painted cities and cityscapes, great panoramic views of Melbourne, and one of the most sensational paintings ever painted of Geelong, which I will leave to him to show and describe. MUP, Melbourne University Press, published a monograph on him, Voyage and Landfall, some years ago. So I feel I bring to you the very finest of Melbourne painting with Jan Senbergs, to be followed by Katherine Hattam and John Wolseley. But first, Jan Senbergs.
Thank you, Patrick. Makes it almost seem important, doesn't it? Well, anyway, well, firstly, I've got to say this. 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning is far too early to talk about art. One should be down at the Victoria Market, or maybe reading the papers with a cup of coffee or something. But anyway, having got rid of that little whinge, I'll get on with it. Well, also, excuse my croaky voice. I'm not going too well with my voice these days. But regarding identity, I mean, the whole session has been about trying to find the national identity, and it's been interesting because I've gone along to some of these sessions there, and there's been a variation of comments and ideas and so on. Quite confusing sometimes as to what it may be. Still is. And the other night, for instance, Gareth Evans said that national identity usually comes from either wars, revolutions, or maybe some certain sporting events. And you see, that may well be true too, but also could it also be called nationalism? Because that sort of thing happens in nationalist sort of situations as well. I mean, for instance, nationalism of all kinds is quite sort of quite modest, assured nationalism, to the jingoistic, to the, sometimes, as we know, through the last century, to the very extremes of dangerous nationalism and so on. Luckily, in Australia, we don't have that, although we do become a bit jingoistic at sporting events like the Olympic Games or cricket matches and so on. And so, but mercifully also, in AFL footy, we don't have that sort of problem, because all we do is become tribal, and we can chayak each other as much as we can, but we don't go to war. So I've been thinking about what to say regarding the national identity, and the national identity in the arts is very difficult to define, because when you think about it, it really goes, if you think about it, say in the Australian context, it goes right through back to the very first white settlement in Sydney, where you saw, for instance, the early untrained painters painting the new settlement of Sydney on Parramatta and so on. And then you go on to, say, the mid-century with the romantic landscapers painting Australia, well-trained European painters who made Australia look more European than Australia in many ways too. And then later on, you sort of came to the sort of sunburned country stage of, say, the plein air painters of Tom Roberts, Streeton, and McCubbin and company, who made Australia look a bit more familiar to us, and so on. And then, of course, later on, you can go through to, say, into the 20th century when we wanted to become more international. So you saw this sort of polite, in the 20s and 30s, you saw this sort of polite attempts at School of Paris Cubism and so on, but via London and so on. So it wasn't until really after the Second World War, around about that time, when down that place at Bloomsbury by the Yarra called Heidi, that you had the painters like the myth makers like Nolan, Boyd and company, and the man on the landscape people like Drysdale and so on. And then, of course, it goes on until about the 60s and 70s, when you sort of found a couple of very distinguished artists, like particularly Fred Williams, who came out and gave us a completely new view of the landscape, but in a very painterly manner, in a formalistic manner. And also you can mention John Olsen too, who sort of had his kind of a more whimsical, at his best, whimsical and positive aspects about the landscape. And then, of course, in the 70s, there was the emergence, the mighty emergence of Indigenous art, Aboriginal art, coming out of the desert people, for instance, in 1970 with out at Papunya and so on, where the art became portable for the first time in a bigger way. And so it's sort of, that's been a fantastic influence, it's still going strong. And so it goes. So it goes right to the present day, to the point where through all the different art movements until today, where work done in Sydney or Melbourne looks exactly the same as in New York, Paris and London. So it's become very global. So you sort of ponder as to where each period claimed a certain national identity, of course. And we still do. We're still looking for it, still searching for it. We can't find it. And you can also draw some sort of conclusions in a similar sort of way to the American story, where you see say the early limners painting their farms and the stock and so on. Then you go on to the painters of the interior in a Western, with the Western painting and so on. Think of Remington and people like that. And then later on to the grand paintings of Frederick Church and Thomas Cole, and then sort of going into the 20th century where you had the Americans wanted to go to Paris, 20s and 30s, so they went to Paris to learn all about Picasso, Kandinsky and Matisse, and they came back to America painting Picassos, Kandinskys and Matisses for quite a while, until after the war, when there's a new breed of young painters who sort of decided to sort of jettison all these sort of School of Paris affectations and start their own sort of home product. And they became the abstract expressionist painting in New York of Jackson Pollock and people like de Kooning and others. And again, so it goes on to the present day, right throughout the different sort of movements and so on, to where things are done in New York and elsewhere are very similar, very global, with all the biennales and things like that around. So it's a different sort of landscape. So we're still sort of looking for it. We're looking for the landscape. And you see, I've got to say, I haven't found it as yet. But when you think of the landscape, we like to think of the landscape in the sense of the bush and so on. There's a sort of nostalgic thing about it. But that's not quite it either, because most of us live on the coast, in the cities and so on. So we're really sort of urban people, most in the majority. And regarding my own work, I suppose, I tend to paint pictures which are landscapes. I'm not really a landscape painter at all in many ways, but I sort of paint landscapes of landscapes affected by human activity, or maybe urban landscapes, or perhaps industrialised landscapes, and different sort of, different areas that I'm sort of interested in over the years. So what I'll do is I'll mention some of my own sort of views about landscape and that. So now that's a painting of Melbourne, of course. In my sort of view, Melbourne's a large painting, and I've always been interested in maps, medieval maps, pre-medieval maps, and things like that. And of course, what was interesting about those early maps before they became accurate was that they weren't just maps trying to find a location to be topographically correct, but they also included figures and images and social commentary, buildings and so on. So there were maps that told a story, told a historical story. And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do, this similar sort of thing of telling a kind of a story of a place, but in the present day form. And there we go. That's my view of Sydney. That's a big painting too. The colours. Can I say once, the colours? Horrible. Anyway, we continue. Sydney, well, Sydney's like a big bird with the CBD and the Opera House, the bridge, and to the left you go out to the Heads and so on, and to the right you go up the Parramatta River. So that's my kind of view of Sydney. I'll actually keep it going. I'll do it this way. Now, I don't paint Australian scenes alone. I tend to sort of respond to things that are out of my own experience. I mean, in the modernist tradition that I was sort of grew up with, it was always considered a great virtue to stay very constant to your work right throughout. And I believed that once, but I don't believe that anymore, because I think as you grow older and as you go along through your experience and through your times, I tend to respond to where I am, what I do, and so on. So most of the work mostly is one's own experience, and you have a reaction to your experience at a certain time. We spent some time in Barcelona there, and I was very fascinated with that place. That's called Olo Barcelona, and it's a painting of the Barcelona architecture, which is very known for very well known for Gaudi, but there are other architects as well as Gaudi around Barcelona. So that's a sort of fascinating place. Now, this one is of Wollongong, Port Kembla. These are all paintings, mostly paintings of my roamings around the place at different times. I went down to the Wollongong area some years ago to sort of just fossick around, look around there, because I was attracted to the landscape of Wollongong, Port Kembla. So I spent about a week or two down there, drifting around, walking and taking notes and sort of finding the place. And what was interesting about this place was that it was sort of, Wollongong, Port Kembla, I see it as a sort of thing. There's one part with this sort of sea, the settlement, the escarpment, and the two bumps of the two hills of Mount Kira and Mount Kembla. So in a way, that's another kind of a map picture of that same thing. I'm starting to mess this up. This is going back to Barcelona again. That was meant to be beforehand. Well, Barcelona. This is the sort of done from a postcard of a sort of aerial view of Barcelona. This is again my sort of map view of Barcelona, with the harbour down below, the old quarter with the Ramblas, up to the Example, and going up to Tibidado at the top of the hill there. So it's sort of very much more of a map picture of the place. And then I have my sequence is not right, but this one is again going back to Port Kembla again. What was interesting about I was fascinated with Port Kembla with the steelworks around there. Naturally, I'm sort of tended to sort of go towards that kind of thing. I found those sort of structures very much like they were like sculptures. And I remember one Saturday night, I thought I'll go around there. I'll drive around there. So I drove around there just to see how it was all lit up and wonderful looking. And as I was driving around there about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, there was not a soul there. I was the only car on the road. And of course, I noticed after a little while there was eyed very suspiciously by the security characters around the place. They probably thought I was some sort of terrorist checking the place out. So I made a slow exit. This one is of the Antarctica. In 1987, I went down to the Antarctica with the Australian Antarctic Division on a resupplied voyage to the Australian bases down there. And we went down to Mawson, amongst other places. And what was interesting about Mawson, I wasn't interested in painting the wonderful, beautiful, fantastic landscapes that are down there. I wasn't interested in that so much. I was interested in the sort of historical aspect of it, the way it's settled, the way it has been settled since the early 1950s, and how, yet in our case, yet another sort of a settlement is encroaching on the new continent and on the edges of it. And we bring all our cultural baggage with it. And so it was interesting to see even the differences between, it doesn't sort of exemplify it very clearly in this particular image, but down the lower part you have these early 1950s Donga huts, what they call the Donga huts. Then you go to the 60s, 70s where the huts are more modern, more constructed. And then you go to the top of the hill where they're all in modules, more recent sort of plastic modules. So in a sense, it's a kind of a history, architectural history already of a place from the very first settlement going up to the different sort of stages of it. And so it goes. And it's painted with this sort of large Antarctic dome behind it, with the mountain ranges behind there. So that's another picture. That's Davis, the other base. And again, the same sort of story. There's a place, again, steep in history already. And of course, there was a lot of rubbish at that time. When we went down there was a lot of rubbish and muck and things like that. So we were unloading all the containers with all the supplies and so on. And then, of course, when the containers were empty, we decided that we should bring all the rubbish back, clear the place up a bit, start to clear up all the debris that's been laying around from previous years. So we cleared it all up, put it back in the containers, and then, of course, they were taken back to Tasmania and dumped some quarry there, I guess, you know. And this one's called Antarctic Night. What was fascinating also about the Antarctic was down there, because the winterers go down there for up to about 40 months sometimes. Once they're down there, they can't come back. So it's a very sort of testing sort of existence, and most of the sort of injuries and people sort of suffering is not from sort of any kind of intrepid trekking, but rather what goes on in one's head. It's a sort of psychological thing, mostly, you know, to live through this sort of dark for months and months. And of course, well, this is terrible. But when you do a sort of a cutaway of a typical sort of hut, at that time in '87, when I went down there, there was mostly men going down there. So what you saw was all these huts were covered in these girly pictures, photographs. And again, there was a history within even those photographs, because there was the 1950s type of sort of Playboy magazines you could see, and there was a sort of later on the sort of penthouse stuff, and so on. So it had a kind of it was like an art movement, an Antarctic art movement, you know. And but then of course the women started coming down and made the blokes ashamed, and I haven't been down there since, but I'm sure they've cleaned up. That's a painting of what I call the swimmer. That's when you're journeying down there in the boat from Hobart down to it takes about 16 days to get down to the bases, and you're going through this ocean, this sort of hostile Southern Ocean, and you're in this sort of sardine can, and sometimes standing on the edge in the bow of the stern of the ship, you kind of think, well, this is rather vulnerable, I suppose. And so I painted this figure swimming, which is a kind of a portrait of all of us in many ways. And you sort of hope that there's some sort of lifeboat on the edge of the canvas, perhaps. This is a painting of the Otway Road. We've got a weekender down the Otways down there, which I've been going down there for years and years. We've been sort of coming and going, so I couldn't help but sort of, again, respond to my sort of circumstance. So I did a series of paintings based on the Otways. The Otway paintings are probably but the only ones in my sort of output, I suppose, that I've done, which are actually more landscapey than the other things, rather than the sort of the human involvement. And that's a painting also of the Otways called the Otway Night. That's also as a result of the area very much. And you see, well, you probably all know the story of William Buckley, who was the escaped convict from the Collins camp in about 1805 at Portsea, who escaped and managed to walk all the way before Melbourne was settled, and ended up at Queenscliff and so on. Then he went on kept going west, and he ended up living with the Aboriginal tribes for 32 years. And he became a real loner, but he was a big man, about over 6 foot, 6'4", 6'6". So he would have appeared a very strange apparition, a white apparition. And so he was claimed by all the various tribes. So he ended up living there and learnt the language and became part of that whole Aboriginal communities that he was there. And anyway, he became very famous in the 1850s, 1860s after he died. And so people started painting sort of legends about him. And this particular image here comes from an early sort of etching of Tommy McRae. Some of you may know about Tommy McRae. Tommy McRae was an Aboriginal painter from Victoria. And so he did this sort of painting, a drawing of a row in a corroboree with Buckley in the middle, the tall figure. And the only distinction was that he was taller and he wore a hat. And so I've sort of done this sort of Buckley figure there with the kookaburras around there and the copulating couple. Now this one is this is my painting called my Geelong Capriccio. Having gone through Geelong over many, many years, I often wondered what Geelong would have looked like if it had been settled instead of Melbourne. And so after a while, I sort of drifting around the area, I tried to reimagine it. Actually, Geelong nearly was settled instead of Melbourne at one stage, but the gold rush and other things, all sorts of other reasons, made it Melbourne more sort of viable, and Geelong didn't get the nod. Actually, it would have been a much more interesting landscape, I think, with the hills and the surf beaches around. So all around the area, like Barwon, around Barwon Heads, there would have been like Bondi Beach. There would have been at least two bridges across the heads. And Portsea and all those areas would have been all high-rise, like Darling Point in Sydney. And so it would have changed, much to the chagrin of the current owners of Portsea and others. But, and the Barwon River, and of course the CBD and the sporting area with Cardinia Park would look like the MCG, and so on. So that's my kind of vision of Geelong. And I find it quite sort of fascinating to think about it. I still think about it often, how it would look like if it was the case. I mean, it would have ruined a lot of lovely landscape. You know, even by now it would have stretched right into the Otways, almost suburbia, and all that would have messed all that up. But it would have been a different landscape. It would have been a totally different city to what we live in Melbourne at the moment. So anyhow, that's my view of that. And finally, that's a landscape looking in the city, into a city office called the Office Kiss, which I'm sure goes on in various offices between 9 to 5. The surreptitious kiss. And so that's what I sort of will probably end my little thing on it. But the other thing I finally would like to say is that with all these subjects and all these sort of places that I've sort of painted over the years and so on, finally what the important thing to me is that finally the subject matter doesn't matter so much in the end. In the end, it doesn't matter because you can have the most interesting subjects in the world if you do a lousy picture. So the whole thing depends on the way a picture is constructed, what you've got to say about it, and how you do it. And I think that's always applied with any painter anywhere, even no matter how interested they are in a particular subject, because the subject doesn't carry it finally, the painting itself carries it. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. Did you notice that the posh people still lived in Portsea in that imaginary vision? Our second artist today is Katherine Hattam. Katherine comes from an extraordinarily rich background in art. Her parents were collectors. They had formed a remarkable collection, which was indeed published once as the Hattam Collection. So she literally grew up with Arthur Boyd and Sidney Nolan and Fred Williams, Roger Kemp, which she had while she was having her Wheaties, even as she was a schoolgirl. So small wonder that she, after graduating from the University of Melbourne, she turned to becoming an artist herself and has a master's in fine art in painting from the Victorian College of the Arts, and then did a PhD at Deakin. She's won prizes. She's won the Banyule and the Robert Jacks Prize for Drawing, and she's a regular exhibitor at the John Buckley Gallery. But perhaps most interestingly, she's somebody who has both lived in the bush, in the country, and in the city, and has retained this very strong affinity with the Australian landscape. And in her most recent series of pictures, Inventory, she began to explore her local landscape, as it were, which is the Merry Creek. And of course, the Merry Creek is one of the first sites at which the Heidelberg School paints. Tom Roberts paints one of his earliest pictures on his return from England along the banks of the Merry Creek. So it's wonderful to have a contemporary artist who's also painting, remembering and recalling for us some of the most important early subjects in Australian landscape. Could I ask Katherine Hattam to come to the podium?
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think you can all see there's a difference. I'm the only woman on the panel, and I think I'm going to have a slightly different perspective from both Jan and John Wolseley. The thing that you can't see is that I'm actually the only person here in this group from the New World. I was born here in suburban Canterbury, whereas Patrick's Ireland, Jan's Latvia, and John Wolseley's England. So I don't know what it means, but my beginnings are suburban, really, and I think that's, whether I like it or not, it comes out in the paintings. Last night, we listened to a fabulous lecture by T.J. Clarke on Cézanne, and he just looked at one or two paintings very carefully and spoke beautifully about them. And what you have to realise here is that I am as if I am Cézanne or Ruisdael standing here. I'm the artist. I'm not someone who is going to be speaking with that kind of eloquence about what I do. And in fact, a lot of the time when what he was saying, I was thinking, what would Cézanne be saying about that? He'd be probably saying, I was trying to get that green right, or I was trying to do that. It would be something much less eloquent, I suppose. So I think what you have to think of me as is I'm kind of the raw data. I'm the fish that you make sushi from. Like someone's going to come along and make something out of what I show. I'm not a theorist or historian. So I go and make the pictures, and then I look back at them, and then other people look at them, and I hope it's, there's something comes out of that. So I kind of wonder what it is that, I suppose what it is that I can offer in relation to identity, and I think the thing is to look at the pictures and talk a little bit about what I think when I'm doing that, but you have to realise that what I think and what I do are going to be quite often very different things. There's a lot that happens in the making, which I think T.J. Clarke referred to in relation to Cézanne. But I mean, both things are very important. Like it's what creates the meaning and we all know that. But the thing is, I'm kind of doing that today, so it's very on top of my mind at the moment. I also do really agree with Chris Lilly when he says it's important not to overthink what you do. And so, that refers back to something that the artist Eva Hess said, which is that the desire comes first. And I do think that the first impulse to make a picture is an emotional, irrational one. It's not, so I don't think I would ever think, I want to make a picture about being an Australian or being a woman. It's like much more I'd be thinking, that something about, cadmium red or quinacridone pink, or thinking what I didn't get right in that last picture, I want to get right in the next one. But there's also something like with the Merry Creek where I want to say something about the pleasure of walking along there. So it's a mixture of those things. So I think I'll start, that's the end of my kind of abstract things, I think. Oh, no, I suppose the thing is, as Patrick said, I do come from a background of like great Australian painting. I mean, I grew up with looking at wonderful Fred Williams painting of the steep road up above the fireplace. Looked at like Nolan and Jan Senbergs, and Boyd, you know, that kind of thing that kind of formed me without me knowing. And I didn't really go to art school till quite a lot later, where I then kind of thought about things more consciously. But I have tried to hang on to that less rational approach. But I think I probably have moved out of that, and as I think the country has in a way, out of that tradition into something where it's celebrating the suburban more, which is someone like Clarice Beckett, Howard Arkley, Noel McKenna, Jenny Watson, John Campbell, those where it's actually looking at what it is we actually live. So I'll start by looking at my images. This is a painting called Inventory, and it is, I see it as a landscape, though people have said to me it's not, or other people have said it's an ironic landscape, but I see it as a landscape. And the centre of it is the Merry Creek, but as you can see, there's personal things down the side, the games of snakes and ladders, the dogs, Olive and Minnie, their personal stuff. There's also the chooks from series, which is part of the Merry Creek. And then there's the Moon Boy up the top, which is something where I think, like part of what I celebrate in my pictures is a kind of psychoanalytic view of life, which is that the inside and outside merge, and that they can coexist, and also that it's kind of, I suppose I relate it to something like a stream of consciousness, where I'm walking through the creek and I'm thinking of, it's like a meditative process, and I'm thinking of all sorts of things. It's rather than, I mean, anyway, I go back to the Moon Boy, is that's something that I saw in 1960s, early 1960s with my father at Sweeney Reed's gallery, and then suddenly, 50 years later, it kind of pops up in a way that I think if you think about the unconscious, where things can suddenly kind of come from the past up into the present. And I think my paintings, I want them to celebrate that and to kind of try and remain in touch with that. What else was I going to say? Oh yes, there's also, the other thing is that I did go and look at the, why I've called it Inventories. Look at this, probably the best painting in the National Gallery, the little Hans Memling of The Man of Sorrows in the Arms of the Virgin, a little tiny painting, which is the figures in the centre, and then little things down the side to do with memory and like associations with that. And so that's kind of what, rather than seeing I don't really see my pictures as, which people have described to me as like, because they're often the landscape seen over the table or through a window, that they're part of a kind of feminist tradition where there's this kind of transitional space, and that you're kind of doing something in relation to a male view of the landscape. And I don't think that art ever comes from that kind of, it comes from some kind of weird, a deeper place than something political. And so I think it's more, I'd stick with the idea that it's where the inside and outside worlds merge, and so I still see them as landscapes. And this is a similar, and it's, the other thing is that in the Clarice Beckett connection is that I really celebrate that, things like the power lines and there's often like upturned shopping trolleys, bits of rubbish from the Preston Market, there's that whole thing in the Merry Creek, while also realising, like what Patrick was saying about the Heidelberg School, it's also where Batman signed the treaty with the Wurundjeri people. It's where a couple of years ago I think they saw a platypus between Thornbury and Coburg. It was written in, I think it was written in an article that Julian Assange camped out there, but he says he didn't. But it is that kind of place. You can kind of imagine things going on. So I do love the place as well as, and I do respond to the actual landscape. So it's not just this whole other, the interior world connected. I mean, that outside world means a lot. That was when actually it is my one complaint about that is an orange, really strong painting. It's small, but it's very powerful colour, which is like someone's tipped a bucket of black paint through it. The thing is, when I first wanted to paint the Merry Creek, which is really going back to that moment of I wasn't thinking I want to paint something about suburbia. I was walking along and I thought, that bridge, it looks like something out of Monet, or it looks like something out of a Japanese woodblock print, and it's this whole feeling of walking through something that's like suburban sublime. It's like my bit of nature that's just down the road, but it's also something where you can see man and also past history of art and things, and that was the moment where I thought, I actually want to make some paintings about this. And then there's the power lines. That's a very little, small painting. And I often also things like where I think I really like to try something on plywood. It's those kind of things that I'm thinking when I'm making pictures. That's the Mary Creek again. And then these are another, like come back to an earlier group of pictures, which I'm in year 2000, I was Australia-China Fellow and spent some time in Beijing with a studio at the Beijing Art Academy. And one of the things that I came back with was just absolutely how beautiful the calligraphy was everywhere, and it was more beautiful because I couldn't understand it. It was like you just saw it in signs. And so I came back and really wanted to use text, but not text where I kind of erased the meaning by drawing over it, but you can see it as just an aesthetic thing. It also was soon after that my mother died, and then she was a great reader, and I reused some of her books, not all of them, but some of them, and that was a kind of a celebration of her and my education here at Melbourne University, where I read like lots of literature, studying English, and also this political science, which was really psychoanalysis disguised as political science. And so we read a lot of the blue non-fiction and the orange fiction, and so this has kind of resurfaced in these paintings, these works on paper. And then again, this like down the sides, there's the Mary Creek, and then the interior is much more central and the landscape is peripheral. But it's whether it's an interior or landscape, it's kind of could be both. And then there's the book covers in there as well, which are to do with the things that I read as a student in the 70s. And so it's about 70s education, a lot of that. This is called Holiday Reading, which is like more, I've spent time living at the coast and like looking out on that, just looking out on the sea, and that contemplative, I wanted to kind of give this sense of that contemplative time and also that thing of reading on holidays. And this one's called Monkeys in the Dark. One of the things about these book page pictures is that I get much more interesting titles because I can go from the books. My titles are like Green Chair, Blue something, they're really not that interesting, whereas Monkeys in the Dark comes from a book that is in there, the book spine. Then this is the other thing that came like right at the beginning of these Mary Creek pictures was, and this is really to kind of explain how I go about it, is that I was wanting to kind of bring up much more the kind of abstraction that's in all paintings, whether they're figurative or abstract. And I was staying in Brooklyn with my sister and looking through the window, and there was this kind of abstract stained glass window, and I thought that's actually what, because I'm not an abstract artist, I couldn't just put something abstract in. So that is kind of why I put it in. And then I start looking at it and thinking, that's kind of like me looking as an Australian. I started to understand why she lives in America and looking out on another culture, on another country, but I didn't start out saying, I want to make a picture about being an Australian looking at, I don't work that way. Then the chair is something that refers to something that I've, painted for a long time, when I say a long time, like 10 years. And there's the mobile phone, which is really like about our experience in the landscape. Everyone walks into a landscape with the mobile phone. The Federation Square was really in the same kind of wanting to take abstraction. Like I was looking for subjects out in the world that were inherently abstract, and like Federation Square is the prime one. It's a perfect example of that. And then down the sides here, I have like a reference to what's in that building, but also landscapes that mean something to me. The Rover Thomas, they're my versions. They're certainly not like literal. Rover Thomas, Fred Williams, Colin McCann, and then Nolan Tenton, Nolan Ned Kelly. So it's kind of I see these as not. I guess there are jokes in there, but they're not meant to be. They're not subversive. They're things where it's a mixture of celebration and with a slight edge to it, I suppose. But they're landscapes that I love and that have formed me, and that also actually are in that building. This is the building, the bridge that first really got me wanting to go in, you know, make some pictures about the Merri Creek. And initially that was just a straight landscape. Then I looked at it and I thought, that bridge, it's like, it's perfect abstract. I kind of wanted to work that into that. And same with the circles, which kind of brings it up more as a painting rather than, I mean, like it's doing something as well as being some more literal interpretation. And I wish I'd kind of been to the lecture last night before I thought about this, because this thing about the pathway in, I was looking and I was going, yeah, that's kind of what is there, but it isn't, I didn't plan it that way. It's just the path is there and I walk along it. The other thing is that, oh, well, I suppose actually what I haven't really talked about is that people have said to me that my landscapes are ironic. And I looked and I thought, I did 4 years of reading literature at Melbourne University and I never understood what irony was. I knew it was often associated with great literature, with Auden, with Pope, and I liked it, but I never kind of got it. It always seemed elusive. And the nearest way I've come to understand this is that I did, as Patrick said, I've been married to 2 farmers like, consecutively, but I've spent time in near Casterton, in this kind of swampy red gum country with like a massive bird swamp at the back of the house, the back of the homestead, and then later in the kind of dry stone wall country with Mount Elephant and the extraordinary kind of rough, beautiful thing of the high rainfall landscape, and then also at the same time, well, in between those, in some time around Broken Hill, in the real kind of outback salt bush, where I would take my children out to play in the dry creek bed, and a couple of emus would wander past, and maybe a few kangaroos, and there'd be a few scrawny chooks out in a little pen somewhere, and it was like this. I do find when I'm walking along the Merri Creek, I'm often thinking back to that. And I suppose there is some element of thinking, this is my experience of the landscape now, and I love it, and it really is my feeling of what nature can do. But it is very different when I see the little blue paper, plastic bags in the thing and the trolleys and things. But so there is that comes out, I think, in my portrayal of the landscape. But the other thing about irony is that I think in the visual arts it's nothing like as clearly talked about. It's when I've said it to a couple of people, they've said, no, irony is, and they talk about really what I think is subversion or what's the other? Satire. But I think there is irony there, but it's hardly ever, it's not written about or talked about as much, I don't think. Whereas literature, it's like it's talked about all the time. So I think probably there is some element of that in and I suppose if I'm thinking about identity, I'm kind of taking it as everything I do is to do with who I am, and I'm not really making those connections, though I could, but I don't know that I'd be that good at that. It's better to just kind of show what I do. This picture here is, it's also about, it's a difference with the others is it's onto plywood, which came from the book pages, so it's like, it's just a shift for me, a formal shift, which is often, well, actually probably always as important as the subject. It's really where I think I kind of want to try that on this way, and it's also at the same time the inside and outside merging, and there's the Merri Creek in the background. So this connects back to the Merri Creek, whereas these two, this one here is like the other thing I think of in relation to our identity, my identity or our identity, is that I've been thinking about New Zealand quite a lot, and I think that it's something about us evolving that to the point where we're no longer as obsessed with the kind of, if I think about it in psychoanalytic terms, we're no longer as interested or obsessed with the parental things of London and New York. You kind of look around and go, so I wonder what the siblings are doing, and you look around and you go, there's New Zealand, and think there's really a lot of very interesting things happening, and I don't think we've looked enough at each other's art, at the history of it, or the contemporary art. Though there have been, just like probably in the last few years, there have been shows at Gertrude Street, the Unnerved at National Gallery, RMIT's done them, Darren Knight shows, Niagara does, Martin Brown. I mean, there's endless New Zealand artists showing here, and it is something that is happening, but it's kind of time that we could have a show of New Zealand art here or Australian art there. There's something, it seems to me, the right moment. This next, and actually New Zealanders have said to me about these two pictures, there's kind of a New Zealand light to these, which I was very pleased with. So these, okay. Oh, I have 1 minute to do my little soapbox thing, which is that the question in this is about whether landscape painting remains as, is relevant, and I think the thing is landscape does. If you look at the artists that are doing things, what worries me at the moment is painting, and I think it's because there's not, at the moment the international language is digital, and there's some absolutely fabulous painting going on here and in Europe and England and America, and we don't get to see it. One of the things that's terrible about being an artist here is you have to get on a plane to go and see things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Katherine. Marvellous talk. I hadn't realised till you stood up that you are our token Australian on this panel, and I hope you feel very welcome. Now, John Wolseley is somebody who, like John Glover and Eugène von Gerard, came to Australia at a mature age. He was a much better painter than Glover was before he arrived, and a better painter than von Gerard was, I should hasten to point out. But he really stands in that really ancient and wonderful tradition in Australian landscape painting of people who are painter explorers, who've come and gone out into the landscape really as explorers and studied it almost in a kind of quasi-scientific way. And indeed, John Wolseley is the only Australian artist I know who holds an honorary doctorate in science from Macquarie University because of the nature of his investigations of the landscape. And often on John's pictures, you will see inscriptions and writings of kind of careful journals as he records his observations and experience of the landscape. He has painted all over Australia, from the forests of Tasmania to the far northwest coastline. He regularly visits the outback. He paints around in his now native Victoria. About some years ago, he held a remarkable exhibition at the State Library. And I saw the exhibition. It was very crowded when I saw it, with lots of school children watching it. And I was really anxious for them that one of them would cut their fingers on the barbed wire which he had drawn so brilliantly and savagely across some of his drawings. So now it's an enormous pleasure to welcome John to the podium as not our last, but our most recent artist explorer, John Wolseley.
Oh my God. Thank you very much, Patrick. I don't deserve that. And I feel a bit small up here. What a wonderful thing that was last night with T.J. Clark. It made us, our attempts to speak so puny, really. Oh, dear. And how wonderfully generous and keen you are allowed to be here after all these days of amazing talks and sessions. Before I start, I want to remind you that many of the speakers have been actually distinguished and wonderful academics and scholars, and I have to remind you, when you have artists speaking, they're not anything like so accurate or truthful. As Picasso said, artists lie in order to tell the truth. And they are also trying to justify their own agendas. Well, this didn't apply to them, but it's probably going to apply to me. So my aim in this little bit is to my aim is to describe some of my own paintings' evolutions and influences, and at the same time suggest that I share similar trajectories with a number of other Australian artists. So I'm going to start with two monstrous propositions, and then attempt to connect them. My first proposition is that the great landscape painters of the Romantic movement in Europe, 1770 to 1870, had within them certain energies and modalities which surged on through successive periods. The idea of the sublime is still with us. I want to suggest, too, that it may have a special relevance to art about land right now. My second monstrous proposition is this. People like us who work within the landscape operate in radically different spaces from that in which our predecessors worked. And as we carry our video cameras and we carry our easels through the forest clearing or past the dry lake, we're now faced with a prospect with what surrounds us is in process of being wiped out or irrevocably changed in a short time. The fact is that sub-Saharan Africa and most of Australia will be unrecognizable and mostly uninhabitable in 100 years. There are various good reasons why most commentators like Tim Flannery have put on a show of at least some optimism, but it was reported in The Age last week that our voting public is concerned not only with an increase in the price of electricity, but with a hike in the price of Mars bars. It looks as though this government may lose the next election because of the very cautious attempts to have the carbon tax program, it tends to have its program, and it just won't go through. It seems that now that we will have 3 to 6 degrees of global warming, and the percentage of CO2 ppm parts per million will be some of the highest it has been since the Pliocene period. So, when I say I want to connect those two monstrous propositions, it goes like this, I think. I want to say there is a strange, powerful resonance between the zeitgeist of the I like that word, zeitgeist, don't you? Of the romantic sublime. In particular, it's centering on the emotional effect of feelings of awe and terror at the power of nature, and our current zeitgeist, which is about a suppressed and often denied sense of dread and catastrophe. I want to take you back, in order to do this, to that incredible time when arguably the most powerful paintings, you probably disagree with this, but he's all right. I'm a bit worried about him. He was frowning just now. I want to take you back to that incredible time when arguably the most powerful paintings about land were produced in Europe. J.M.W. Turner, Cousins, Constable, Cotman, John Martin, James Ward, Philip de Lutherberg, Caspar David Friedrich, Eugene von Gerard. It was a strange time, similar to ours. Herschel, the astronomer, Davy, Coleridge, Shelley, Joseph Banks were all part of an incredible period, weren't they? One of the most kind of churning revolutionary periods. And the Industrial Revolution was up and running, and paintings like Rain, Steam, and Speed, Turner was fascinated by primary elements like wind, sea, climate, and carbon. Look at this painting by Turner, which we have up here. You can just see it in the murk. Here the giant element forces of climate and geology dwarf the little figures of Hannibal and his troops. Do you see down on the bottom there? Oh, I love these layers of things. There's somebody asleep over there. I'm going to point it at him. Hannibal. Dwarfed. Dear old Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher of the sublime, would have loved this painting. It's in a different category from the beautiful. The sublime, as you'll remember, for him had raging storms, extreme weather events, and Milton's description of the kingdom of hell. There was a terror, but a strange, perverse pleasure in that terror. It was a kind of cosmic schadenfreude. I thought that up at 2 o'clock this morning. He talked of the terrible sublime, the noble sublime, and the magnificent sublime. Here is von Gerard doing the terrible sublime. Here you see him as he is in that wonderful exhibition next door, being our Antipodean version of Caspar David Friedrich. He came, as you know, from that same period of German culture and brought it in that wonderful mix of romantic obsession, which I think we all share, yes, we all share, with a scientific passion for what landscape does, how it works. I want to emphasize this phrase, how it works. Here is Caspar David Friedrich himself. Here's Caspar David Friedrich. Yes. Here you see some of the elements which make up the sublime, how Gaia works. Yes, and the connection between the tiniest plant and the whole cosmos. Here in this painting, you can see the earth exhaling and breathing the morning mists. How they link earth and sky, demonstrating just what his contemporary Alexander von Humboldt based his life work on, describing the cosmos. Weltgebaut, Weltraum. Humboldt, who, as Stephen Jay Gould said, may well have been the world's most influential intellectual. Wonderful! It's amazing. It's amazing. The thing he wrote called Cosmos, I expect several of you read it, it is the most incredible book. In it he wrote, he wished to describe a wider horizon of the assemblage of all the material things with its spaces filled, from the remotest nebulae to the smallest lichen. Cosmos parallels James Lovelock's Gaia, books about Gaia, in the most incredible way. Right, I'm nearly getting to my end of my rant, because, yes, I thought I'd do the first thing. There's modalities in these different talks. I'm doing a rant, and then I'm now going to, I like the word rant, don't you? I'm then now going to go and show you some of my paintings. But just before I do, I'm going to say this. Gary Catalano, who many of you will remember, is a wonderful poet and art writer, wrote in 1984, the most terrible invention of our industrial civilization has not been the bomb, but the idea that the self exists as something apart from the earth. It's just this kind of disjunction that I feel we painters of land can do something to mend. As Toulet said, les artistes sont ceux qui passent leur vie à relier les morceaux détachés du monde. Artists are those who spend their life putting together the broken pieces of the world. I found that inside a CD cover. Now I'll show you a few images. Normally, I spend a lot of my time camping in strange, wild places. And here I am, as I have been often, in the Sunset, Murray Sunset country, where there's huge fires have gone through. In fact, as we had here, I know oh my goodness me, I'm going to do that terrible thing. Yes, there we are. One of the strange things that's been happening with climate change is that people who work with fire in the bush have been saying that the regime has changed. In cases like this, near the Waith National Park, there's been a fire going through, and then 6 months later, another fire has gone shooting through. And then a year later, another fire's gone shooting through. So that in the old days, there might be one fire, and then it would wait quite a lot, but the behavior patterns are changing. And so one way I've been dealing with this is that to cut a long story short, I take 50 sheets of the most expensive Arches paper, and I walk through the bush, and I throw it into the air and let the winds blow it around against these little fingers of the burnt trees for a month or so, sometimes 6 months. And when I come back, I pick them all up, And at the same time, I start doing big watercolors, which are in using the actual quality of all the things that are happening around me, like insects. Sometimes I leave it out, often it's left out over several days, and I'm working it in these pools. I'm trying to mimic the way nature actually works, the way the processes work, so that sometimes the kind of reticulation that happens as the paint dries becomes almost like the reticulation on a dry riverbed or a pool. And then when I've done these big sploshy things, I say my splosh period, I then take these large drawings and move them, rather than the old artists, you know, well, I'm an old artist, the old artists, and a lot of you are old artists, no, you're mostly rather young, actually, but you look at the landscape and you do this with your pencil, don't you? Oh, yes. Ah. Oh. Ah. And the extraordinary thing is that in some ways, those marks are very limited. We get into sort of habits. If you allow and work with nature, the most extraordinary things can happen. So that the strange marks that happen, in this case, I was doing two. I was moving the paper against the trees, and then I let it fly away. The extraordinary thing is that what happens is that you get marks which you'd never dream of. One of the wonderful things about having a really bad display, one of the things is I find that the better the university you go to, the worse the projection is. It's unbelievable. I mean, but the wonderful thing about it is I can actually tell you that this painting is bloody good. But you can't see that. Oh my God, do you know what I've done? Oh, yes, yes, oh, thank you. So here we are, there's all the kind of aggressive and exciting and lyrical and strange marks that have happened through this more wild process. And then I draw extremely detailed studies of the actual place. So here I am by the sea, and these wonderful spiny-cheeked honey-eaters are there. And I wrote here at 2 o'clock this morning, after a very nice, wonderful dinner, and 3 more glasses of wine. I wrote to myself, when one paints, one often says to myself, what kind of animal have I made? What on earth is this thing? And so I put this thing up, and I said, well, what is it? I said, this work is on the romantic side, not very cool, I'm afraid. So quite a few of my younger artist friends don't think I'm very cool. Somewhat lyrical. It is a sense of foreboding of fierce fires just passed through. It's scientific. Well, they're closely examined birds. Some of my Twitcher friends are not quite satisfied. Most of these... Oh, incidentally, talking about Twitcher friends and birds, when you go out, you'll see the new book by me and Barry Hill with masses of birds in it. It's a book of poems. It's in the books thing out there. There's pause for commercial here. And in readings, fabulous book. What else is this painting? It has a sense of... it's about fire and water and the elements, and it tends to be about the connection between all the living elements in the natural world. So I like to think that I am distantly connected to some of my wonderful predecessors and my contemporaries in Australia. If I had time, I would have liked to follow a line of thought through such artists as Drysdale, Lloyd Rees, Ulrika Moore, and discuss less obvious candidates for my thesis, Susan Norrie and her videos, Fiona Hall and her work about the disjunction of nature and culture, Rosalind Pigott, Tessa Rappaport, Carl Logge, Philip Hunter, Ash Keating, Juan Davila, Ewan MacLeod, Andy Martin, Julie Goff, and Jan... He doesn't want to be there. Now, I want to pause just very quickly and say that I'm on very dangerous ground, though, if I was trying to enlist the vast body of contemporary Aboriginal work about land into this sublime thesis. in fact a large part of the romantic sublime, has lent itself to a strong colonial and magisterial annexation of the land, a position which is radically opposed to the whole approach of indigenous culture in this country. The fact is that the incredible explosion of Aboriginal art in the last 30 years, as you can see just down the road, have you seen that amazing show of all that new stuff? It's called Living Water. Is a supreme achievement, and in my opinion, overshadows all us Ballender artists. Now, I'll shoot you a few more slides, and then I'll let you get off to lunch. This is a superbly beautiful painting. And what it is actually a huge drawing with a lot of those things, bits of paper, which have been blowing around through for several days. And what I did with my last show at Rosalind Oxley Gallery was I had this painting. There it is, and with these. And then I had it was a huge wall, and then I had what is probably the most beautiful and significant and powerful diagram of the last 50 years, which is the Keeling curve. Quite a few of you know what the Keeling curve is. It's in Hawaii, a scientist started in, I think, 58 to measure the CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's the most beautiful thing because, as you know, the CO2 in the northern hemisphere is taken in by photosynthesis because all the leaves are there. And then, so it goes down, the amount of CO2 in the air. And then when, in the winter, it increases. So this is a picture of the earth breathing. So my idea was that I would have this kind of thing, the site, and then I would show how these bits of paper registered the carbon on the ground. They were kind of detective things. They were going around registering it. And then this showed you exactly what was happening. And what is happening is that the CO2 now is at the same, is getting to the same level it was, hasn't been since the Pliocene period, when it was far, far hotter. So we are, it's an inexorable thing going up unless we do something drastic about it. And the other last three, have I got 2 more minutes?
1 minute.
Oh, 1 more minute, my God. This is a profoundly beautiful painting. This is a picture of the swamps of the Guaida swamps, the Guaida wetlands, which is the most wonderful area where I wanted to do a painting as often where there's a sense of the whole thing as being some great organism, and that the tiny details, the different birds that are there, are all related to it. And here we have a heron in the by the Loyang Power Station, where it's in a swamp, opposite where the ancient Devonian swamps are being turned into coal. And my last picture is the mural you might have seen in the city square. And here I hope, which if it wasn't such a disgusting slide, we have got some beautifully drawn mapping of how the Godwits, the great wonderful waders who come all the way, they fly 27,000 kilometers every year, all the way from Alaska and Siberia, all the way to New Zealand, and then back again via us. One of the most greatest and magical stories. And so here we have a sort of diagram of how the fact that they've gone down now, their numbers have halved in the last 8 years. The reason being that all the areas here are being, which is in Korea and China, the Yellow Sea, they've been filled in, so their staging posts have gone. And on the right-hand side here, I like the idea that this is a kind of net, a linear net, which has been filled in with the lyrical and wonderful life of birds. But here we have El Nino doing strange things and maybe being locked in position, while up here we've got extreme weather events of the kind that Turner liked, and so forth. And but it's a wonderful story, because I've been going there for 4 years, and me and my friend Darrell Albertson, who is the head of the DCNR there, he's managed to get the government to buy it, because the actual area is completely surrounded by cotton, and it would have been taken over by, being lasered, and like so much of New Zealand and Queensland, it would have been taken over by cotton. So, I just want to, in a very happy note, if you saw this painting, or you had it in your home, the lyrical excitement and joy of seeing in nature a whole mass of birds flying into the air is just stupendous. Thank you very much.
Well, the question before us today, and particularly this morning, is do we feel that the Australian landscape has made a very distinctive contribution to our identity as Australians, as people who live here? And I think we've had 3 fascinating responses to this particular question, and now it's your time and your turn to be able to ask questions of our panellists. Could you identify yourself when you speak and use the mic? If it's not too much to ask, could brevity be the soul of wit?
Certainly. My name is Bronwyn Bain. I'm a mature age PhD student at Ballarat University, and I have a question for John Wolseley. Your notebooks, I've seen a few things in the catalogues, and in one you've written, it's all about energy. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that. Just across the top of one of the pages of the notebook, from it's the Wittenham to...
So it's all about energy.
Yeah, you just written that.
Did I quote William Blake, who said, "Energy is eternal delight"?
No, well, you might have, but I couldn't read the top part.
Yes, I like to think my work, a lot of it is dealing with energy fields. The extraordinary thing about when you're actually dealing with the landscape, you forget it's trees, birds, whatever. You think it's different forms of energy. This is rather a kind of a Zen or a Buddhist idea that everything is just comes into being and is in different forms of energy and turns into certain things, then falls back into the great energy pool. But for an artist, it's a terribly good thing, because you actually don't have to get the leaves right. You just have to get an analogue of leaves, sand, sky. So that's probably what I was muttering about on that sketchbook page.
Thank you. Next question. On the left, up there, thank you.
I guess my question was catalysed by John's rather gloomy consideration that climate change may be almost at a stage of no return sooner rather than later. Do you think that implicit within your working methodology there is this sense of sort of implicit atrophy, the way that you put the materials of your craft out to the elements, and so nature is kind of almost partly eroding the work. Do you think that that's something that is implicit within your work?
Oh, I hope not. I hope not. I think that I have this sort of feeling that artists should... Well, it is, because this is the most important thing that's happening. It's not only global warming, it's species loss, it's what we were talking about yesterday in this wonderful biodiversity thing. It's that when the processes of nature start to collapse, which they are, then it's not that we're worrying about the wilderness, we are part of it. And once things start to actually head down into a tipping point, then terrible things will happen. But it's no good. You normally, like Tim Flannery and everyone, there's no good saying, oh, it's all terrible, because we've got to have some hope. And my way of dealing with this actually is to try and work with nature and show that it is enthusiastic, it is positive, and amazing and wonderful things can happen, and show the beauty of it rather than actually say it's all gloom and doom. So it's only in conferences like this that one can actually admit that it does look disastrous. But in one's art practice, no, I'm not. If anything, by linking the processes of nature with my work, I hope I'm showing that within the cosmos and with the processes of the earth, the things will go on. Do you see what I mean? So one wants to celebrate. Otherwise, if I actually was saying oh, it's all disaster, I mean, I never say it normally. I just happen to say it to you because you're very nice.
I want to just for a moment widen the very good question was asked and ask Katherine Hattam and Jan Senbergs. One of the things that's very striking about both of your views of the landscape is the way in which human intervention is almost continuously present in both of your landscapes. I mean, Jan, when you're in the Otways, I notice that you abolish all the holiday houses and you return to primal bush, but there's that road sneaking through it. And Katherine, the bridge is as important as the creek when you're doing Merry Creek. And I wonder if you have a sense that the Australian landscape somehow comes alive for us as a place when there is that sense of human intervention.
I think there's, in a way, no such thing as just landscape. I mean, its landscape comes with baggage, it comes with what you bring to it. And if you're making a picture of it, you've been there. And I was thinking of this, it's like it's not just because it's the suburban landscape. I was thinking if I was to paint, say, Uluru, I would paint it from, I went recently and it would be in the context of going in the car with the family and the arguments, and it would be all of those things. So I think it is definitely about the interaction between those two things.
Jan?
Well, I suppose, as I said beforehand, my landscape generally is about the evidence of human activity in most of the things that I've done. And the Otways was sort of an odd one out in many ways because that was about the closest I came to nature, unlike John. But you see, the thing about all these things is whether you're painting a sort of mining site or some evidence of human contamination, I don't want to be preaching about it. All I want to do is show it, make a sort of statement, not a statement about it, but actually just show this is how it is and leave it at that. And in a sense, it's for others to judge, make the comments and say this is terrible or not. I mean, I went to Wittenoom once and it was fascinating there. Going to Wittenoom was completely out of the way now because people don't want to forget about what happened with the asbestos mining. But you see this wonderful landscape, beautiful, rocky landscape, blue skies, great escarpments, cliffs and rocks, fantastic landscape. And you're tempted to paint it, except in the middle of it, there's the slag heap and all the other sort of remnants of an activity. So in a sense, how I see it is, this is a place of beauty in many ways, but it has a sort of sinister past. It's like something happened here, but the actors have all left. The stage is empty, but the props are still there. So in a sense, that's how I paint my landscapes mostly.
More questions? Here on the bottom right, thanks.
Thank you. A question for Katherine. You said something about, and I thought it was fantastic, art is where the inside and the outside meet. And I thought, how simple, what a good mantra. I really understand that, because you were talking about psychoanalysis and the interior memories and family and things. And then I thought later, no, I didn't understand that, because there was the interior of a lot of your rooms and the outside. And I thought, now, did you mean it's where your interior, art is where your interior and the outside world meets, landscape, or the domestic interior, the houses, for you and the outside world meets? So did I understand you or not?
I think you did understand. I think it is, I mean, I don't see a split between those. I mean, it's partly in making a visual, if you're making a picture, it's like a way of expressing that. I mean, I think of it as, it's not a good person to mention because she doesn't actually, she's not seen as radical as she was, but I think Virginia Woolf did what I would like to try and do, which is in something like Mrs. Dalloway or into The Lighthouse, where there's constant movement between the inside and the outside world, and where the landscape and the interior are kind of influencing or projecting into each other. And that's really what I'm trying to get across. And, you know, so I think both things are true, really. It's like it's not a literal thing. It's really not just looking at the landscape through a window. I mean, it is that, but I do always seem to want to have both things there. So.
I wonder if John and Jan would like to comment on that. I remember one of the most famous kind of mantras which was laid over us was John Olsen's expression, I am in the landscape and the landscape is in me. Yeah. And I wonder if you would say that was true, John, for yourself, and Jan, for you.
Well, it is in a sense, but I'm also slightly detached from it as well, because you have to be a kind of an observer, you know, in a way. And the landscape is important, very important, because I enjoyed the thing of, perhaps, you know, I used to go camping a lot and going out in the bush and so on. So it's not a case of not enjoying it and being part of the landscape, wanting to enjoy it all. But my sort of take on it is one of what's happened in the landscape. And also, not only that, well, not all my landscapes are of particular places. There's also the sort of landscape of the imagination, where you do a sort of concoction of ideas, of thoughts about a landscape which you put into one painting. So in a sense you're detached from the landscape, but you're very involved in seeing how it is. And in a sense you create a sort of new painting, and maybe nothing to do with the actual place. So it's not always a sense of place alone. So it varies. But no, I'm not totally in a landscape to that extent. No.
John,
I think that. I take a different view in a way. I feel that the most strong thing is what Gary Catalano said, is that we've allowed ourselves to invent a completely parallel way of living. Air conditioning, everything means we don't actually look at or feel nature. There's a wonderful line in Henry Vaughan, the metaphysical poet, when he said, you do not see the world aright till the sea itself moveth in your veins, and you are clothed with the stars as with a raiment. It seems to me that it's our separation, which is perhaps one thing that artists can start to help to heal, as I tried to describe. But it is a chronic, because we are a runaway aberrant species, we've invented this separation. And the reason why we're allowing global warming to happen is, as several writers have said, there's a split between our instinct and our heart and our cognitive. It's a radical split. It's a major aberrant thing. So we can't sense, we won't believe that the temperature is these terrible things are going to happen, because our mind says it might, but we don't believe it until it's actually our body. And my feeling is that when you're actually within nature and you see what birds do, what all these things, all the way things happen, then you start to live properly again.
In the front.
Professor Cornell Norseman from the School of Hard Knocks. I wonder, John, if you could just tell me, you mentioned the fields of energy. I wondered if you would be of a like mind as myself, and feel that people should sleep north to south and capture all the fields of
That's an
energy.
excellent question. Let's stop there and get the answer.
Did he say, were you saying should we capture the fields of energy?
Should you sleep north-south to capture the fields of energy?
I think definitely north-south.
Good. Perfect answer. At the very back, thank you.
Vastly different natures of the landscape between England and Australia. What was your initial response to the Australian landscape when you first came here?
Oh, it was for someone who does work in the land, I have to be blunt with you, it was just gorgeous because you can't do landscape painting in England. It's always raining. all my, that's why I used to oil slightly better. So the short answer is we're so lucky here that we can actually go out and paint all day. It's just stupendous. But the other aspect of this is that in Australia we can actually see how ecosystems work, and that's what's so exciting. And it always puzzles me why more people aren't interested in these sort of areas, because in Europe it's like a great big garden splodge. It's all been changed so much that you can't actually see the bones of the landscape, you can't see how it might be working, and a large number of the birds and things have already died. So,
do you think, John, though, for you and for Jan, that there's something about that you see it fresh because you come from, I mean, it's different from me because that's kind of what I know. You have the advantage of seeing it from a different perspective, like as you're describing. And the same with Jan, I think.
I'm not sure about that because I can't compare it with being brought up here. The one thing I do know...
Did you, when you came here, think this is, like you're saying, very different from what?
Oh, just like paradise, like magic, and yes. So that yes, when you try to you're able to if you emigrate at the age of 38, you can reinvent yourself because you suddenly are able to see it fresh. Yes, good point.
Jan, would you like to comment on what your first experience of the Australian landscape was?
Well, you see, I came here when I was very, very young, only about 10 years old. So in a sense, I've grown up here. I'm very much part of here. I don't, recall very much from as a kid before coming here. But the landscape, of course, I do remember when I first came here, being out in the bush the first time. This sort of sense of hearing a kookaburra, and you realise there's a kind of a freedom, it's a sort of a sense of wonderment. It's a wonderful feeling, and I had that. And so it was very interesting to me to sort of to observe all that. But as you grow older, you become more aware of other things as well. So in my case, like I said, I'm not really a landscape painter in that sort of sense. I appreciate the land very much, and what John says about the land regarding the climate change and all those sort of matters. But my take is slightly different. I also think sometimes of, say, somebody like Fred Williams, who painted the landscape and showed a completely new way of seeing the landscape. And he, well, Fred was really a city man in a way who went out in the landscape. And he also enjoyed the landscape equally as much as anybody else did. But really, he was a studio painter of the landscape. And he was very concerned about the painting of the landscape and actually innovating and giving it a new look so that we can see the landscape in a new way. I think that's the importance of it. So what I'm trying to say is you don't have to be part of the landscape to be always absorbed, in my sort of feeling, to try to understand the landscape. But the landscapes vary. There are all sorts of landscapes. I can't deny that, we're a very urban nation, and I think the idea of the urbanity is equally as important as anything else. We don't like some of it. I mean, I don't like some of the way things are being planned out either. But it's there. And in a sense, that's what as an artist, you do make some sort of comment, a reaction to where you are. And in a sense, that's where I am. And so I do that. That's the way I...
Isn't it also, Jan, that the landscape is the starting point? It is something, and as was for Fred Williams as well, there's a tension between how much that landscape means to you, which is like why you paint it, but also the whole formal process, which is...
Well, yeah, the formal process is important. Like I say, I think it's important to sort of, in the end, no matter what you're painting, I think it becomes very, very important that the painting has some sort of identity. We talk about identity, sort of national identity also. Most painters are looking for a personal identity of some kind as well. And you see, I mean, what's interesting also, the pull of the landscape, as this title here is, it's very strong here. I mean, John is a great example of it, for instance. I mean, of all the artists that I know who know Australia, nobody knows Australia better than John Wolseley. I mean, there's no other artist who goes out there, into the actual landscape as much as he does. But there's all kinds of different ways of taking it, you see. And what's also interesting, I find it interesting that we still have this pull of the landscape, which is very valid, I think, very valid. And when you say, for instance, when you look at American art in New York and so on, strange enough, the Americans don't have that sort of pull of the landscape still. They're much more interior, it seems, more cerebral, perhaps. And it's a different thing. Same thing with our Indigenous art, the Aboriginal art. It's got a real vivacity. It's got a fantastic presence, which other countries don't have. I mean, for instance, the American Indigenous art hasn't made that kind of a mark, because the mark here of our Indigenous people is so strong. And that's what gives it the sort of landscape, the feel of the landscape. There's all sorts of reasons why we do the landscape. I hope we still keep doing it for a while it's there, you know.
But actually, it's worth pointing out, which I think something fascinates me, is that there's a huge amount of work, artists like myself in America and Europe, doing things about these sort of things, who feel we've got to, the job of the artist is to actually do things about the great dynamics of things. And it's incredible when there's wonderful books like Badlands is one which is in print now. All the artists who deal with feel the job of the artist is to, in some ways, is to be a bit of a seer and say things about the land. And it's a very interesting thing, as Jan says, we are here most peculiarly metropolitan nation. It's so ironic when we've got this unbelievably stupendous geomorphic mass around us that we're actually the most paintings generally are really so much about the urban thing. It's fascinating.
Any questions? Here on the right.
Sarah Jameson. I'm a PhD student by project at RMIT. I'm a photographer. I've been exploring my identity as a migrant, and I've arrived after exploring my own identity because I didn't quite know who I was or where I sat. I realised I was a migrant, although I'm white and don't look like one. So I found an identity with my migrants in Dandenong. I then said, where I have an Aboriginal urban girlfriend, and she lives at Merry Creek, and she introduced me to her land. And I had always seen Merry Creek through my eyes, which was... but she has made me want to explore what now, as a migrant, in an Aboriginal land. And I was thinking about that disjunction between ourselves and our land, John, that you were talking about. I'm not sure how it's going to pan out for me in exploring that, but my latest images were about the sea edge and the Aboriginal family that she has included me in, and it's a great privilege to be there and understand that, to have that opportunity. But it's opened up another door for me, and I wondered if you had some comment about having people who are of Indigenous background as friends and how that can affect our work. Thank you.
Oh, I feel terribly strongly about that because we're at the stage now where some of the elders, there are stupendous elders still with us. So much of the knowledge is going. But if you talk to the great Yolngu artists like Jambawa Marawili, or I was up there with Fiona Hall and several other artists, you realise that you've got such a magical resource when you talk to those people. And as you say, they can lead us in and teach us so much. To walk with Jambawa through the landscape, there was one particular place where a shark in the first morning had been tethered in some way in the sea, and it had escaped, and in its anger it had carved out all these mountains. And I was reading Charles Lyell at the time, who talked about how mountains were made, the great geologist, and you suddenly realize that their sense, the mythic sense and stories is just so incredible. Yes, so I think that we must realize that a lot of those people, the next generation is really inventing all manner of wonderful things, but they're actually losing some of that. And now's the time to go and find those people. Yes.
Katherine, as the mistress of Merry Creek, would you like to say something about that?
Yes, but I don't think I can do what John just did. I think I love the whole thing of the Indigenous art and things, but it is not my. It's not my history. It's not. I mean, it is my history in terms of being an Australian, but I would think. I was thinking that this conversation is much more about the subject and about, like, I think that there's a whole other subject which is painting, and like it's landscape painting. And for me, I mean, this is not quite answering the question, but for me, I would look at the work of non-Indigenous other artists like Peter Doig or Nigel Cook, or artists who are making wonderful paintings at the moment about the landscape. It is not. It really isn't the subject for me as much as it is. It's like the starting point. But so I don't feel that I'm not part of that tradition at all. But I understand what you're saying, and I think that's a totally other thing. That's not my identity, I guess. That's not really mine.
More questions?
This time I should introduce myself, Bernie Joyce. I've spent many years in the School of Earth Sciences here. My question is that I look at the landscape irrevocably now, I think, as a geologist, and I see things in it which influence any relationship between me and the landscape. Now, our speakers have come from different places to Australia, and they've perhaps developed approaches to the landscape, and I was just wondering if any of them particularly have been influenced by their knowledge. We've just been discussing the Indigenous people's idea of the landscape. Have they changed as they've taken on that sort of background in the way they look at the landscape?
Well, I think both John and Katherine said something about that. So, Jan, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I'm very aware of the Indigenous art, and I've gone out to some of the settlements over the years, and a great admirer of it. And I remember going to Belgo and Turkey Creek and places like that back in the 80s, all around the place, stayed there for a while, watched the painters work and so on. So I have a real interest in it, but I can't say honestly that it has changed my way of working, because I've got to also say that I'm an urban painter who's an observer, and when you see the indigenous art, it's quite fascinating actually. When in Belgo, for instance, when I was up there, we watched the artists at work, and they were working away. Mostly women were working. The blokes were sort of hanging around, not doing so much, but they claimed some of the paintings at the end of the day. But it was when you got talking to some of the artists there, it was quite interesting. You would ask some questions. You would say, "Now, are you interested in what's been done down at Yuendamu, say, or somewhere else, some other settlement?" And they would say, "No, not really, no." And so you sort of got to realise it was a community. Naturally, it is a sort of community of painting. But they reminded me of New York artists. They're exactly like New York artists. It's all very communal within the place, in a sense. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, but I think it's sort of relative. I think we live in a kind of in an area of community all over the world, various sort of communities. And in a sense, I'm unlike John to that extent. I'm not sort of messianic. I'm not saying you're a messianic, John, but I don't want to lecture when I would rather observe and make a point and leave it there for others to sort of interpret it. And also I like to leave some of the sort of images that I do in slightly ambiguous ways, particularly if you're doing certain sort of structural things. I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't put figures into one's painting, because the moment you put a figure into it, you straight away give off the sense of the scale of all the objects around it. So there's all kinds of reasons like that to do with making a painting. But sure, it's an observation. It's always an observation that you respond to. And as I say, as you get older, your curiosity becomes more, strangely enough, and you suddenly realise you're running out of time.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. Because I think in some ways I have actually been influenced, but not in terms of, it's been more that what Indigenous art, the great thing that Indigenous artists have is this sense of like my place and my, like doing something which is personal. I went to like the Gallery of Modern Art, and there's, in the non-Indigenous section, a lot of it is photography, a lot of it is like no hand of the artist. And in the Indigenous part, it's like rough, hand of the artist, like this sense of authenticity. And I think that has been a marvellous influence for me, but not, I don't feel like I can connect with the stories, but this like a return to something that in some ways has become lost for some non-Indigenous artists.
In the front here.
Oh, hello, my name is Selena Long. I'm a primary school teacher, and I've got a question for the panel about linking with you, Katherine, about the trip to Uluru with the family. Lots of young families take big trips for a whole term out to the outback and around Australia these days. And I'm wondering how we can teach our young to link the urban, the mediocrity out there that's Australia, but also Aboriginal culture and coming back to record it themselves artistically. How can we pass that on so we can connect the two, the urban and Australia, for our children? Thinking about John Brack's painting, The Car, comes to mind.
Yeah, it's a good picture of what it was like driving along as a family, I think. It's a very good picture of that. But we did have like four of us in this car visiting my son who'd worked up at Papunya, and we went and drove around, and there was a family fight in the middle as we were coming to Uluru, and my daughter would not look at Uluru. She looked away, kept looking. I kept saying, have a look at it, look at there's Uluru, and then we actually realised it wasn't Uluru, it was the thing before that. Then she actually did look at it, and it was this amazing transcendence. Though the arguments fell away, and it was a marvellous experience. It was terrific. I have a photograph of her in a Motorhead T-shirt standing next to Uluru. It's great.
Now, is there anybody in the middle, because of these lights, which are intended to blind the chairman, is there been waving or just drowning? I see somebody at the very back there.
This is for the panel. I'm Denise James from Mildura, and I'm here with some Indigenous students, and I'm speaking on their behalf. And they were saying, as Indigenous people, their connection to land is unquestionable, and they belong to the land and feel that it's part of them, and that is part of their whole kind of being. What else did you want me to say, Robbie? There was another question. And why, oh yes, why do you think that the presence of the landscape is so strong? And do you feel that it actually comes from the first people, or what else did you say? Yeah, that's about it, I think. Was that it?
All right. Could the panel respond quickly to that one, John? Do you feel that the primacy of the land comes from that primary Indigenous experience of the land?
The land and the many nations who lived on it have forged such an incredible relationship that you can't talk to one without the other, and there's this. Again and again, I'm driving through outback places, and I stop, and I sense some kind of power which is coming from. They sometimes use a phrase morphic resonance, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but there's some incredible linkage and power that you sense all the time. I really do believe, yes.
I think it's an interesting question. I think there's no doubt, no dispute about the fact that the Indigenous people belong to the land, and it's their land, and they're doing their work according to their culture and so on, which is true, which is wonderful. But we got to remember, we also can't deny that we are all of us migrants to a country. So we're all migrants. We're all adapting over the years in different ways, and so we're building up a kind of our take on the landscape in different ways. This happens in every country around the world, every continent in a way. Wherever in the new world, you're always invading somebody's native land. That's always been the case. So the fact is, after a number of years, you also become part of the land, but not in the same way. You can't, because you haven't got that entitlement to start with. So in a sense, the sort of landscape painting that the Western sort of characters of people like us do is inevitably is another exploration, perhaps another way of looking at the land, and maybe they make some other sort of contribution to it in a different kind of a way. And I think that's something that ought to be considered in a way. It would be quite fake of me to sort of, as much as I love Indigenous art, there's been some wonderful, fantastic artists. There's no doubt about it. If I started taking bits and pieces from their art and started doing some of those images, well, it wouldn't be true. It wouldn't be true for me, and I'd feel I'd be contriving in a sense. So in a way, you've got to find your own direction. It's all like we were talking earlier about identity. We've got to, in the end, we are kind of looking for an identity. And I think you can't deny one's identity, but you've got to probe deeper into your identity to find out what it is, at a deeper level. And I think you can't kid yourself about certain things like that. So in a way, you sort of work along those sort of lines as best as you can.
Katherine, do you want to make a quick response?
Having, as I said, being married to two farmers, I've been living on land where the families took the land up in 1840, and there's another kind of attachment, but it doesn't, I think they're kind of coexistent in a way, though maybe that isn't as simple as that. But I do think, like Jan said, there are different ways of, and I certainly feel that while the Indigenous one is something that I can't claim and I admire, but I do think, and I think it comes out in the painting, but I think there are other ways of relating to the land, and I certainly don't feel it's less.
I'm going to draw this session to a close now. It's always the best way is to end with one arm waving in the air. I remember years ago, Sir Joseph Burke, who was the first Herald Professor of Fine Arts here at the University of Melbourne, he once complained to me that first Russell Drysdale had ruined the Australian countryside for him, because wherever he drove through it, all he could see was Russell Drysdale. And he was just getting over that when Fred Williams came along, and he ruined the rest of the landscape, because all he saw was Fred Williams's wherever he drove out into the landscape. And in a way, it's an amusing remark of Joe's, but it also is how much we continue, I think, to see and to be refreshed in our view of the landscape and see the landscape as a resource by the extraordinary vision which we've heard about this morning from our three panellists. Before I ask you to show your appreciation of them, could I just correct myself? When I said that the afternoon session began at 1:30, I meant that if you wanted to get a very good seat, you should come at 1:30, but the session itself will start at 2 p.m. as advertised in the programme. But may I now, on your behalf, ask you to show your appreciation to three remarkable artists.